Hello, welcome everyone to our second of 4 sessions as part of the Academic Engagement Network's Improving the Campus Climate Initiative Spring Webinar Series. I'm Naomi, Director of AEN's Improving the Campus Climate Initiative. For those of you who are not already familiar with us, AEN is a national organization of nearly 800 faculty members on over 265 campuses. We work to promote campus-free expression and academic freedom. We support robust discussion, research, and education about Israel in the academy, and we counter anti-Semitism when it occurs. This past year, we launched the Improving the Campus Climate Initiative to address the growing trend of anti-Semitism on U.S. college campuses. Through ICCI, we are educating and training campus administrators and staff in student affairs, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and related offices to increase their knowledge and understanding of anti-Semitism and how to best support Jewish and pro-Israel students, faculty, and staff on campus. We are pleased you are able to join us today. The design of the program is to bring together a small group of campus staff and administrators to engage in a small group conversation with scholars and experts on anti-Semitism. It's a seminar-style format, and after the presentation, there will be time for questions, engagement, and discussion. Following the webinar, you will also receive a specially commissioned paper written by our speaker on the topic that she's addressing. So for our webinar today, we have Dr. Donna Robinson-Devine, the Morningstar Family Professor of Jewish Studies and the Professor of Government Emerita at Smith College. Dr. Devine has taught a number of courses on Middle East politics. She's able to draw on material in Hebrew, Arabic, and Turkish, and she is the author of many books about the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Zionism. She has served as visiting professor at Harvard's Middle East Center, Yale University, the University of Sydney, the University of Hamburg, and the University of Geneva. She served as president of the Association for Israel Studies from 2017 to 2019, and is an affiliate professor at Israel's University of Haifa. Really an impressive resume, and we're honored to have Dr. Devine here with us today to provide important nuance into the history and development of Zionism, and to engage with us about the nuance and complexities of Zionism today. So thank you, Dr. Devine, for sharing your expertise with us. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about the historical circumstances that gave birth to Zionism, both the idea and the movement. Zionism is a more contested than understood phenomenon, a badge of honor for some, a call to arms for others. Those enthralled by the notion of Jews seizing control of their national and historical fate are matched by others inflamed by an image of Zionism that has been decanted into a kind of settler colonialism, embezzling resources from the presumed rightful inhabitants of the land of Israel. Some see even Israel's founding in 1948 as a sign of Zionism's success, while others see it because of the war that was inevitably a part of the establishment of the state as a failure of Zionism. So for Zionism is sometimes, for some, a shorthand for evil, for others, the name of a sacred mission. It's ironic and perhaps interesting to note that Zionism is not unused to being embedded in controversy, because it was born and developed within the midst of major controversies swirling around the dense Jewish population of Eastern Europe. And these controversies had been going on really from the 18th through the late 19th century, when Zionism sort of made its public appearance. The problem and the controversies that the Jewish community were engulfed in had to do with the sense that their collective future, their collective national life was coming to an end. there was kind of an aura of apocalypse that surrounded Jews who thought and discussed all of these issues. Part of the reasons for this, for the fear and the controversies, was that the Jewish communities in Eastern Europe had been damaged and harmed and severely by wars, wars between the Kingdom of Poland and the rising Russian Empire, so that the Jews within a Kingdom of Poland had found an economic place, hadn't found absolute security, but were able to organize their own local governments, even their own regional structures to sort of govern their own affairs. And then when Russia conquered these areas and eliminated the Kingdom of Poland, Russia acquired a population of Jews it didn't want. It saw, most of the czars saw the Jews as a hindrance to the modernization and to the growth that they wanted. So, for example, you had Nicholas I in the 1830s imposing very long-term army service and conscription on Jewish communities, and forcing the local councils, the Jewish local councils, to make the choice of who would go off for the 25 years in the army, and essentially been lost to the Jewish community because they often were conscripted at the ages of 12 and 13. For army service. And so you had not only harsh political policies imposed on the Jews, but they were constrained in their movement. They were limited in the kinds of occupations and professions they could use. They were encouraged to learn Russian, to convert, to leave their Jewish schools. And the Jews, most of the Jews who felt that it was important to retain Jewish culture, Jewish authenticity, Jewish religious life, were concerned about how to do that. And so you got different views of how to do that. Even in the late 18th century, you had a serious critiques of the Talmudic rabbinic culture from the emergence of Hasidic, of kind of charismatic piety and spirituality. You had religious leaders, typical religious leaders, saying, well, we have to expand our school system. Instead of training rabbis in Talmud by having them sit at the feet of scholars, let's have institutions, school institutions that were essentially boarding schools. The development of what we call the yeshiva occurred as a means of preserving the religious culture, preserving the national culture. You got other people who said, no, scrap it all. Let's assimilate. Let's, even if Russia isn't democratizing, let's cooperate with the efforts to modernize. Let's go to Russian schools. You got people who said, no, this is not the way to do it. We can be authentic Jews, even if we modernize, but use it with Hebrew culture. So you got the development of the Hebrew novel coming in. And you got people who said, look, Russia is never going to modernize, never going to democratize. Let's become revolutionaries. The only hope is a revolution. So in all of this turmoil, though, most Jews in Eastern Europe decided that the best way to respond to these awful economic and political situations, sometimes developing into actual attacks. So we got the invention of the term pogrom. Most Jews in the 19th century decided to react to all of this with their feet. They emigrated. They marched out of Russia to the United States, to England, to other parts of Western Europe, wherever there was an opportunity. And that further fragmented the Jewish community, because we understand today, a large refugee population and immigrants fragment families, fragment social relations. So in a sense, Zionism arose to say, okay, we're falling apart. Our traditional culture is falling apart, but this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to control emigration. This is an opportunity to control our future. So let me share this screen here. And do this. So you got really what is considered the first formal definition, or the first formal call for the Jews to take their future in their own hands, that and create a national society or create a national entity, comes from Leon Pinsker. Leon Pinsker was a very assimilated Russian Jew. He was a doctor. He didn't know Hebrew, but in the and he had always called for Russian Jews to get a modern education as much as they could, even with all the restrictions, with all the discrimination, try to do it. And his little tract called Auto Emancipation really calls for the Jews to take control of their own future, that there's always going to be anti-Semitism so long as they are a minority, and a minority that never fits in to the larger culture. So, they're always the other. For capitalists, they're communists. For communists, they're bourgeois. They just will never fit in. And instead of being passive about it and thinking, well, we have to pray to God to save us, we have to bring in a Messiah, we have to do this or that, they have to take it in their own hands to be active, to create organizations that will allow them to move together, to gain some control over this refugee crisis, this emigration, to gain some control and to go together in an orderly fashion to the same place where they could organize from the ground up. Now, interestingly, Pinsker didn't insist that it had to be the land of Israel, though people who embraced his ideas began a movement called Lovers of Zion, Chovevet Zion, the first international Zionist movement before the World Organization, the World Zionist Organization. They started raising money, very limited amounts. They started raising money to buy land in what was then Ottoman Palestine, that is, the land of Israel or Palestine ruled over by the Ottoman Empire. They started purchasing land and creating farming settlements. Why land? There were no other obvious productive resources in this part of the Ottoman Empire. So it wasn't as if you necessarily had to be a back to the nature person. This just made some economic sense. So they started the first so-called Zionist immigration wave in the 1880s back to Palestine. Or the land of Israel. It was small. They had all sorts of difficulties. but I think the important point here is that Zionism initially meant being critical of traditional society, traditional Jewish society, and taking action to do something about it. It didn't necessarily create a loyalty to a particular geography or a particular place on the map. And interestingly, when Pinsker died, even though he had been president of Chovevei, the Lovers of Zion organization, in his will he left them very little money, and he had some resources. The next person to really develop this idea was Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl, like many liberals of his time, argued that if the Jews were going to develop some sort of national entity, they couldn't do it without considering politics. It couldn't be simply some inner energy that came out and bought land. He thought the settlements, he dismissed them as kind of a teapot phenomenon. That what Zionism needed really was to show that it had political potential, and that its organizations had political potential. He was very careful about organizing the World Zionist Congress as a legislative body that they issued bonds from a bank. They didn't have any money, but there were certificates. That it had the earmarks, and it had the characteristics of a proto-state, and that he really sacrificed his life and his fortune in trying to secure what he called a charter, that you needed some great power to support the idea of a Jewish entity, a Jewish state, someplace. He was willing to consider, as we know, other places, but as temporary measures, but he understood that Jews felt from tradition, from prayer, from everything in their history, a connection, a direct connection to the land of Israel, and that this would be the ideal place for it. I want to just mention that in looking at great power support, Theodor Herzl wasn't unusual for his time, or for a period that you might say lasted decades after his death. He dies in 1904. At any rate, he approached the Kaiser, he approached the Sultan, he approached British politicians, anyone who to whom he thought he might have access to support this idea, as did Arab nationalists at the time, as did other nationalists at the time who understood that they were very weak and were trying to gain independence from one or another entity that ruled them. Now, within the Zionist movement, because the land of Israel, the whole idea of the land of Israel had been talked about or written about in so many Jewish texts, whether they were religious or utopian. There were many visions of what a land of Israel should be. And so if you're talking about creating some new entity, it tapped into all sorts of views by people who called themselves Zionists. One of the most influential was a man named Echad Ha'am. Echad Ha'am was a literary critic, a person who believed that it wasn't only that a state was needed if it could be founded to safeguard Jews, but it mattered what kind of Jewish culture or Judaism was protected. And he was very devoted to the Hebrew language, developing the Hebrew language. He edited journals that published new Hebrew poets and writers. And his view, at least before World War I, was that it was very unlikely that the Zionists would have the resources to create a large entity that could, or an entity that could support a large number of people economically, but that it could be the beginning of a rebirth of a new kind of Jewish culture that would be authentic in the sense that it would tap into the Jewish canon, but use that tapping it with modern ideas. So he wanted to bridge, to bring modernity to Jewish culture. I'll talk about, so now I have an example of a thinker who's associated with the socialist Zionists. The Zionists who, the founding Zionists and the first generation of Zionists who went to settle and live in the land of Israel in the early 20th century, before World War I and just shortly after World War I, were teenagers, were very young, were, most of them anyway, were imbued with this notion of not only going back to the land, not only working, but creating a new kind of society. So you had people, some of whom were initially attracted to one or another form of Marxism, Bolshevism, Menshevism, whatever form of Marxism to which they were exposed. And because Marx and most of the Marxist movements premised the notion that a socialist revolution would disband national identities, would erase national identities, these people wanted to preserve national identities, and so tried to fuse in one way or another socialism with Zionism. And they did this by creating, instead of giving having a sacred quality to religious life, to the stipulations of religious law, the sacred thing was work, toil, labor. A Jewish state, a Jewish entity, a moral Jewish entity could be developed by workers, by people who toiled on the land, who learned, who could fulfill themselves as they fulfilled the nation. So those are the ideas that Zionism started off with, but there were enormous numbers of there were enormous numbers of challenges that they faced. Let me just show you some of them. They had to convince people that the land of Israel wasn't just for prayer or a place to die in, to be buried in, as these pictures, some of these pictures show you, but it was a place that could bring life, that could sustain life. And they did it. They wanted to show that they could help survivors get to Palestine. This is pictures of the Exodus. But more importantly, they wanted to show that they could create the new Jew, that through work on the land, the Jew wouldn't be sort of the schlemiel, as some people have talked about, wouldn't be this passive person who spent his days in a Talmudic academy praying, but would be somebody who did something, who wasn't like the Jew of the exile, who didn't have those passive values, who wasn't, and to show the difference, these socialist Zionists adopted and insisted on speaking Hebrew. That physical labor was important, that self-realization had to come through doing your national duty, that it wasn't a personal thing, it was a collective thing. So the Zionists actually wanted or projected an image, even though a very small percentage of the immigrants who came to Palestine went to live on a kibbutz or went to live on one or another agricultural farm. Very small percentage. Most of them went to the cities, went to build a Tel Aviv, build up a Haifa, build up a Jerusalem, or live in the surrounding areas. But they projected an image of the pioneers. That was their image. And living with that image, they projected that image as symbolic and expressive of national identity. But national identity was indeed more complex. Remember, I said that many of the people were teenagers, and when they came and tried to develop egalitarian communes, as some of them did right after World War I, imbued with this notion of egalitarianism and flouting rabbinical authority and living in a totally different kind of social network, it was easier, let's say it was easier said than done. Where there's a wonderful story of one of these communes called Beitania, where the leader was Meir Yairi, who became the leader of Hashomer HaTzair. And when you look at what he was saying as he was leader of this commune, he talked about there was a lot of homoerotic language. Male spirituality was the height of what you could do. And then he disappears. Nobody knows where he's gone. And he comes back with a wife. And they said to him, "What happened? You're talking about male spirituality and you have a wife. Where did you go?" He said, "Well, I went to find a rabbi." They said, "You went to find a rabbi? You're challenging rabbinical authority." He said, I couldn't, not be married with a rabbi. My mother would be angry. So there were all these mixtures. There was a high percentage in the early 20s to the late 20s of suicide. These were teenagers who felt they couldn't measure up. And the question was, in Jewish religious law, suicides are buried outside of the regular cemetery. But these people wanted to mark the people, their survivors, their friends, didn't want to put them outside of the Jewish cemetery. So you have instances where the members of the commune were trying to bury one of their dead comrades, and a rabbi would come and dig him up and bring him to a different burial site. I mean, it was very difficult to sort this out. And I want to show you, Naomi, you want to, I have one of the prayers that is sung on the Day of Atonement in or Yom Kippur in at least in Ashkenazi synagogues is called Kachomer Biyad HaYotzer, like clay in the hands of a creator. And it's sung to a tune that's quite well known. There's some Sephardi congregations that use it now too. It's sung to a tune that was created in a small town in the Ukraine by members of the Chabad or Lubavitch group. So Naomi's going to play the prayer first.
כחומר ביד היוצר ברצותו מרחיב וברצותו מקצר כן אנחנו בידך חסד נוצר.
Naomi, you want to, okay. In 1929, an immigrant who was in the Haganah and was stationed in Tel Aviv or someplace like that because of the riots, heard that his wife, who was on a kibbutz in the north of Israel, had just given birth to their first child. And he was so moved. He was so incredibly grateful that he created a lullaby, which is quite famous in Israel. So Naomi's going to play the lullaby. Okay, just in the interest of time, it's the same tune. They came from the same shtetl in the Ukraine. That was the tune he knew, while Chava Alberstein is reciting the prayer that we're all in the hands of a creator, and there's a limit to human control over one's life. He's saying, go to sleep, my son, your mother's right there, and tomorrow get ready to work. Go get ready to work on the land. So what the Zionists were able to do was to create a kind of culture that both celebrated certain ideals, but in fact couldn't always match them. But to Zionists, Zionism meant that you were holding up a standard that you tried to strive for. And what, just in the interest of time, I just want to mention that Zionism, even today, where it's often associated with people on the right wing and people not upholding some of the humanistic values that were once a part of it, that's not the only way in which Zionism is used in public discourse in Israel. You can get people like David Grossman, who's obviously a very important person on the left, and who says that you can use Zionism, the idea that if you have an idea by human will and human nature, you can solve all problems, including those of the Palestinians. And he's used it to argue that it's consistent with Zionism, its commitment to Zionism, that should bring a resolution of the dispute with the Palestinians. So I know I've gone on for a little longer than I expected, but let me just say that perhaps symbolic of all this is yesterday, Israel marked Holocaust Day, marked what happens to Jews without a state. And in another week, they will commemorate Memorial Day and Independence Day, which gives an accounting of still what Jews have to pay and what Jews in Israel and what all Israeli citizens have to pay for the price of a Jewish state. And they don't forget that.
Thank you. Really, really enlightening, very engaging. We're a small enough group that I think we don't need to use the raise hand function, but if folks want to ask questions, they can unmute themselves and ask and hopefully engage in some dialogue about Dr. Devine's remarks.
Dr. Devine, thank you so much. I really appreciated your talk, and a couple of questions come to mind for me. One from early in what you offered and one at the end. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your comment that in the early stages of Zionism's evolution, that there were certain Arab nationalists who, in fact, were also supportive of the idea. I think you alluded to it in terms of an opportunity for some of these Arab communities to themselves look towards self-determination vis-a-vis the Ottomans or the British or other colonial powers. So I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious to hear more what you mentioned at the end, how certain readings of Zionism or interpretations of Zionism can in fact create a context for thinking about resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So really curious about those two things, if you could say something.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you raised the first question, because what perhaps I wasn't clear. What I was trying to suggest was that Herzl's insistence that you needed great power backing for whatever the Jews were going to do in terms of national ambitions was not unlike Arab nationalists who also wanted great power support. That, as far as we know from the documented record, in the Ottoman period, in the early period, the Arab journalists who wrote about Zionism, or there was after the Young Turk Revolution, there was a limited set of elections based on very limited suffrage to the Ottoman parliament. As far as we know, all of the Arabs who voiced opinions or wrote about opinions thought of the Zionists as a grave danger, which in and of itself was interesting, because at the time they were writing, Zionism, if the Jew on the eve of World War I in 1914, the estimated Jewish population of what became Palestine was about 85,000, which is a very small percentage of the population. And even of those 85,000 at that point, probably 60,000 were not Zionists. So by virtue of population, by virtue of their economic standing, their limited control of land. They didn't pose much of a danger to anyone, which I find quite, I mean, we could have another session on the Palestinian issue. You know, in a national movement, what a national movement has to do, you know, there are always leaders. There are always people who are going to define the movement, the goals, the strategy, set all of this. But they've got to get people to go along with that. And they're really asking people to risk life and limb and perhaps their prosperity to go along with this venture if they're in fact coming against an established authority. So the question is, how do you get followers? And what the Palestinians, I've argued and others have argued, have not been able to do is to structure a society where the leaders have the absolute legitimacy to be able to pursue policies that they know will be followed. So there have been kind of civil wars, if you will, within the Palestinian community. What the Zionists did, I mean, they had a split when before Herzl died, and when he brought the issue of whether to negotiate Uganda as a temporary place for safeguarding Jews, he was he died, and ultimately it was defeated. There was a group who ultimately became what was called the territorialist movement. They said you can be a Zionist without being attached to the land of Israel. We're gonna be an organization that's going to try to create a national autonomy for the Jews, and we're gonna scour the globe to see where we can find a place. And in fact, they found no place. Even Australia, Western Australia, was desperate for people, and when they went to the governor of Western Australia, he said, "Not you guys." So that particular territorialist movement disbanded when the British issued the Balfour Declaration, because in a sense, they got what they wanted from the British in the land of Israel. They tried Latin America, they tried Africa, you know, they tried everywhere, no place. So that's what I meant on the earlier kind of thing. I think there's no question in my mind that more Israelis, that a majority of Israelis, if they felt they feel that they have a challenge to try to broker some kind of agreement with the Palestinians, that it's kind of a moral obligation, if it's not a political one, to do that. And there's no question in my mind that the insecurity they feel about the Palestinians comes from the continued embrace of what is violent resistance, and that signals to most Israelis a kind that imparts a fear, a reasonable fear. The numbers of casualties from the Second Intifada, which erupted after negotiations failed in 2000, the casualties were as heavy as in the Yom Kippur War. So that's not something that the Israelis are going to be easily forget. But still, it's not something they're going to see as not a challenge.
I want to defer to my counterpart at Emory if she'd like to ask something, but I also had one more, an additional question, Donna, more specific to the topic at hand. So Zionism itself, this is the the best understanding I've ever had of sort of the specific set of historical, political, economic circumstances that really gave rise to Zionism. It's helpful for me to understand that. And I also would imagine that in your field of this scholarship, that there's that this elicits a certain healthy tension between an understanding of Zionism as again, a product of a very specific set of historical circumstances and a crucial political development in the 19th and 20th and now 21st century. But that also is different from some who I think might perceive Zionism as sort of an inevitable or ultimate culmination of the destiny of Jewish peoplehood. And I say that as, you know, I think there are people who would be highly critical of Zionism who would want to embrace that interpretation, and others who are very supportive of it who would want to embrace that interpretation. So I just am, there's not really a question so much in there, but I find that really interesting. And that must create some unintended additional scholarly consequences that you and your fellow academics have to work through.
Yes, I like to work through narratives by looking first at facts, kind of. But I was trained partly as a political theorist as well. And at a place like Smith, you can't simply teach the area in which you mostly do your research. And when you think of the late 19th century, if you think of intellectual history of the late 19th, early 20th century, the two looming figures are Marx and Weber. And the ideas that they gave birth to had to do with people not having much independent, autonomous role in changing or shaping history. You were either part of the certain class, or you were stuck within the cogs of a bureaucracy and stopping a kind of creative change of policy or change of direction. Zionism was unlike both of them. Zionism, you know, the funny comment that people quote of Herzl, "In tirtzu ein zu agada." If you will it, it will not be a legend. You can think of yourself as being able to do anything. Mm-hmm. Think of yourself, if you can imagine what you want to do, of going and doing it. Now, for a very long time, if you look at the history of Israel, about to celebrate, I guess its 74th year, correct? I think 74. If you look at a large chunk of Israeli history, really up until the last two and a half decades, self-fulfillment wasn't necessarily, self-fulfillment in terms of a profession, wasn't necessarily part of Israeli culture. It had a small market. It had limited capacities if you wanted to be a physicist, and you couldn't find a place in the 4 or 5 universities that could accommodate you. You probably had to go to the United States or find your fulfillment in a profession elsewhere. That's not true in Israel anymore. Yeah. People, particularly with the global economy and the kind of modernized thinking that has gone on and been encouraged in Israel, if there are a lot of people going to Israel now for a personal self-fulfillment. So it's changed quite a bit. but it's still got that discourse there that is reminding people, even though it doesn't always appear in the English newspapers, that are reminding people that there's still an obligation to live up to the ideals that founded Israel, that they can't just ignore that.
Thank you.
I think that's a really nice note to end on as well. And thank you, Dr. Devine, and thank you to our participants for engaging. I know that many
Thank
others will be
you.
interested in watching this webinar. And really thank you, because I think Zionism is such a big topic, and there's so much nuance and so much tension that comes up when people talk about Zionism. And so the way that you are able to bring sort of the scholarly backing and the passion that you bring to the conversation, I think is really helpful for the administrator. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for participating.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all. Have a great